Hello, fellow professor and students. In this video, our group will introduce you to Chapter 5 of G. John Ikenberry's book, After Victory, the Settlement of 1919. The Peace of 1919, or the Versailles Settlement, has been questioned by many studies, as the treaty has been seen as a failure that led to the loss of peace, the limits of liberal internationalism, and the collapse of the possible democratic world order at the time. The settlement led to leaders of Europe and America clashing over the design of the post-war order and the basic logic of order, an important aspect of reconstructing the new world status quo after the Great War. As the United States emerged to be the superpower after the war, President Wilson proposed an ambitious agenda to bind the democratic states together in a universal association, or also known back then as the League of Nations. With this plan, the US tries to infiltrate the European order and tries to establish itself as the great influence in the region. In August 1914, few expected this war to become a Great War, or the First World War as we have known it now. In the post-World War I era, the social and economic destruction left by the war has been unprecedented and unanticipated. The status quo of the world has shifted to the United States as the forefront of the economy. During and after the First World War, many nation-states rely heavily on the US for financial assistance and war supplies. Consequently, the US passed Great Britain in economic size and productivity in the 19th to 20th century to the point of being unrivaled threefold in size and efficiency by 1928. To quote from Arthur Walworth, the author of the book America's Moment, and I quote, "The British owed several billions of dollars and in turn had loaned billions to continental powers. The American Republic has risen to the position of power as Europe consumed itself." American war aims and settlement ideas. Initially, President Wilson's administration struggled with their policies toward Europe on two aspects: how to help end the Great War and how to foster a post-war order that would ensure peace. January 1917, he proposed the idea of peace without victory, a peace among equals, an idea of the US staying out of war and determined to shape the peace settlement with Europe through the establishment of the League of Nations, a union that participates in international peacekeeping without force and the military. Nevertheless, the German army decided on a policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, threatening the US water with a possible invasion. Wilson reacted and declared war against German militarism, not against the German people, as he stated in his goal of the war, as he quote, "For the ultimate peace of the world and for the liberation of its people, the German people included." The British and French war aims. In the late 1916, Wilson's peace initiative was disliked by the British because it drew only a few distinctions between the German and the Allied responsibility for the war and their war aims. In the early 1918, Lloyd George gave a statement to represent Britain and its war aim that they were not fighting for the dismemberment of Germany or its constitution, but the adoption of democracy would make the peace negotiation easier. Reparation must be provided, and lastly, George stated that three conditions are necessary for the lasting peace, which are 1. The re-establishment of the sanctity of treaties, 2. A territorial settlement based on the right of self-determination, and lastly 3. The creation of some international organization to limit the burden of armaments and diminish the probability of war. France's most important concern was security, especially post-war towards Germany, since it has been invaded twice within 50 years by the German. Thus, the French war aims were much more simple than the British or the Americans, though equally unclear. The government led by Prime Minister George Clemenceau was determined to restore European balance of power and make its military power superior to Germany. The French strategy of pursuing this aim resulted in three main strategies of the French. 1. To diminish German power through territorial dismemberment, reparation, and disarmament. 2. Conciliation and engagement of post-war Germany, or the participation in a peacekeeping institution that would supervise Germany. And lastly, 3. The containment of German power through alliance and aggregation of Allied power. In 1919, Clemenceau proposed the framework of the League of Nations as a more traditional alliance with international army and general staff. This would put France in the position of power that it desires and protect it against any future emerging threats. As the war came closer and closer to ending, the British, the French, and the Americans started to notice each other's different causes for fighting in this war. Meanwhile, Wilson finds himself stuck in a more difficult position to bargain in the post-war settlement as his domestic power position has weakened, along with the lack of sign that Germany will democratically reform. In contrast to the French and the British, whose elections were held prior to the peace conference, they were in a position ready to bargain with Wilson. While the American wants Germany to adopt constitutional democracy in order to accept its unconditional surrender, the French and the British want their commitment from Germany to disarm. They also push for agreements on the settlement of post-war territory on the German border, with Lloyd George and Clemenceau threatening to reject Wilson's 14 points. The Americans had to give in to additional conditions of giving the British concession on freedom of the seas, giving the French reinforced border security around the Rhine. Germany also additionally now required to be confiscated of military armaments and the reparations to compensate the cost of the war paid by Germany. Wilson had to give in to what the two leaders desired in order to achieve his ultimate goal of this treaty, which is the League of Nations. So what are the expected commitments and restraints of the League of Nations that Wilson, Lloyd George, and Clemenceau desire? To what extent do each nation is willing to bind themselves and give their power to the League? For President Wilson, he sees the League as an instrument to lock European states into a new type of order, where the League would ensure a peaceful settlement of disputes and promote the democratic value and governance. Others in Europe gave their support for the League as they wanted the United States to be more involved in the region to bolster their post-war security and form a more traditional security relationship. Wilson believes that the alliance of democratic nations act together. Traditional security commitments or territorial guarantees will no longer be necessary, as he believed that the construction of the League would lead to a long-term achievement of peace. Wilson's vision of the League of Nations was an association of democracies that would provide mechanisms for preventing conflicts. Members of the League would make a commitment to guarantee a peaceful settlement of territorial disputes and work together to oppose stubborn states. But at the heart of the League, there are two conflicting constituencies. First, the France concern of security issues, and the second, the ambiguity of American politics. During the Paris Conference, two proposals for post-war security topics were discussed. First, it was the talk that the alliance of victor states should combine their military staff, which was advanced by the French with an ambition to make a supranational organization to guarantee its security. Another proposal was the Wilson's League, talking about the agreement of the League that bound its member to an alliance of non-aggression under an explicit obligation. Wilson's underlying notions were about the evolution of the legal and moral institutions. Therefore, both of these are not easy to impose on the society. He stated in Paris that the League was a living thing that slowly becomes a part of a set of obligations and expectations that states would eventually assume. When Wilson took the US into the war, he had the support from the citizens and even from the opposition party, which is the Republican. At the time, some of the Congress were skeptical of his security ideas and the lofty formulation of his peace without victory proclamations, but the majority are still with him. During 1917, Republicans matched Wilson in pushing the US into the war. The former President Howard Taft and Theodore Roosevelt called for an active role of the American in the post-war peace. It was at this point that Wilson introduced partisanship. He campaigned for the return of the Democrats to the Congress, which created a party division over Wilson's peace plan. The election resulted in the Republicans winning the majority seats in the Senate and the House. Before the end of the World War, Wilson's peace proposal in January 1917 triggered a debate with multiple views. The critical point was the binding character of the American security commitment to the collective security organization. Objections and concerns from other states ultimately put information of Reservation 14 in all of the treaty. The most important one was Reservation 2, which explains that the US assumes no obligations unless the Congress made a specific decision to assume such obligations. Furthermore, Wilson resisted the reservation on Article 10, arguing that it will destroy the foundation of collective security. He rallied the Democrats to defeat Lodge's reservation on Article 10, and as a result, the Senate defeated the treaty by a vote of 53 to 38. Wilson's goal was to orchestrate a democratic movement in Europe and in the process, encourage the public opinion to take side with him. There was enthusiasm from the population in Europe, but political leaders were far less receptive, partly because of the military success in 1918 in France and Britain, and because of the American reluctance to use its power for fully international goals. He visited Europe in December 1918 to win over European opinion to his position and articulate a liberal principle via open diplomacy, restraint on reparations imposed on Germany, and the formation of the League of Nations to enforce peace. But the question left during the time in the Paris conference still remained. It was not clear, practically speaking, how the adoration of the masses could be converted into tangible political leverage. The appeal of Wilson in Europe did not sit well with the European leaders. The United States did pursue an institutional order building strategy after the First World War to make incentives and opportunities to reach an institutional platform that will lock other states into a like-minded international order. This is a program launched by Wilson's to operate within international institutions and uphold collective security. But in the end, the institution bargain failed, by the reason that France wanted a more traditional and binding security guarantee than the US was able to provide, and a modest institutional agreement tied the US to Europe less directly through the League of Nations, perhaps supplemented by other specific inducements and commitments. The direction was decidedly moving to a more conservative and patriotic direction. The way that war had ended led to the deterioration of Wilson's peace program.